This is something familiar, isn't it? It is a rear derailleur. It is one of the most fetishized components on a modern bicycle, at least in the eyes of the people who want to sell you one, because they are very persistent in putting one of these little mechanical gizmo from a higher component group on a bicycle that is otherwise spec'd with a lower tire components. Considering how persistent they are at doing that, it must be working. Anyway, I am not one of the people who wants to be countercultural, so, since this is my corner of the internet, I decided to start describing bicycle components, because that's what I want to be doing, from this. Also, hello there. For the sake of my presentation, I'm going to be using 3 rear derailleurs. One is a Shimano Nexave T400 long cage with a rapid rise parallelogram spring. One is a Shimano Saint crossed with Shimano Dior clutch, because I wanted to make one. And one is a Shimano LX 570 with a cage from another Shimano derailleur. Functionally speaking, rear derailleurs have 2 distinct functions on a bicycle. One is to guide the chain to the other cogs on the cassette in this fashion, using the parallelogram mechanism. And the other one is to provide tension for the chain, which is required because cogs on the cassette are obviously of different size. Just about every modern rear derailleur is built around the same pattern. This part is called the B knuckle. This part is called the P knuckle, or sometimes A knuckle. A derailleur has a parallelogram mechanism, like this one, and it has a cage with 2 pulleys, one guide and one tension, which swivels around a spring-loaded axle here in the P knuckle. Derailleurs come in 2 major flavors, and this one is an example of first. This is a classic Shimano or Campagnolo design, and I personally call it a dual pivot design. These derailleurs have 2 spring-loaded pivots, one here at the P knuckle, which is responsible for moving off the cage, and the other one at the hanger bolt here. These springs in those pivots are working in opposite. When this one gets tensioned as you shift to the lower gears, this one gets released. This gives these derailleurs 2 very important design features. One, they track the curvature of the cassette very well, and 2, they are rather agnostic when it comes to the size of the cassette they are handling. This derailleur, in spite of being almost 20 years old, I believe, will happily handle 36 cassette, which was released, this year I believe, and they will handle 25 cassette or possibly even 23, which, if you think about it, is really cool. Moreover, because these 2 springs are working in opposite, and you are obviously tensioning one as you shift and you are releasing the other, these derailleurs usually provide rather uniform feel at the lever as you shift. There are, however, 2 very important disadvantages to those derailleurs. One, which is very important for mountain bikers, because they are very flexible, they don't hold to the chain as well as the other design, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. And 2, which is also important for mountain bikers, but is actually annoying to everyone, some designs had a tendency to violently bump on the frame with the P knuckle on certain gears, which actually led the Shimano to develop a different design of the derailleur. The other derailleur design type is what I call a single pivot design, and this Saint / Dior is an example of one. As the name suggests, there is only a single pivot here for the cage to rotate around, and the connection to the frame is fully rigid. This has major advantages for mountain riders. First of all, since the connection to the frame is rigid, it simply can't clank on the frame, so it's much more silent. Moreover, because this guide pulley moves very little or none at all, as the chain is taken out, there is much more chain security for the entire drivetrain. However, these derailleurs come with multitude of disadvantages. First of all, as you shift, you are always tensioning some spring. So, trying to shift to certain gears requires quite a bit of force. Moreover, you are pretty much married to the size of the cassette the derailleur was designed around. This Saint, using a little mode converter gizmo, can handle anything from 28 to 36. However, regular shadow derailleurs from Shimano, trying to run them on anything but 36, 34 or 32 is an exercise in frustration. Saint will handle 28, but nothing less than that. If you take a look at a modern derailleur, you will quickly notice that the parallelogram is slanted. This is a very important design feature because it ensures that the trajectory of the guide pulley, the upper one, is going to follow the shape of the cassette. This is such an important design feature of a modern derailleur that when a patent for it expired in 1984, it was a design feature that was universally adopted by just about every drivetrain manufacturer on the planet, especially in the higher-end groups. It is also one of the few features that differentiate road and mountain derailleurs. Let me show you. Welcome to the donkey end of the bike. What you see here is a rear derailleur and a cassette, and of course a chain in the middle of the cassette. The unit here is a Sunrace RDR90 road derailleur with a short cage. As you can see, the slant angle, the angle here, is somewhat similar to the angle of the cassette, which is 1128 Shimano unit, and if we measure it, it's approximately 25 degrees. Here you go, 25 degrees. This is a road derailleur, so it has to track a road cassette. This cassette is actually wider than most road cassettes, or at least in the 9 speeds, because on a road bike with a 9-speed drivetrain you would expect 1123 to 1125. This derailleur is actually capable of handling 1121, which is a very narrow, very specialized cassette, often used on time trial bikes. Okay, this is the second example. This is the Shimano ZFR rear derailleur with a short cage and a clutch, and this is an 1136 rear cassette, also from Shimano. If we measure the slant angle of the derailleur, it comes up as approximately 45 degrees, which matches the slant angle of the cassette, which is also about 40-45 degrees. And the third example. This is a Shimano Dior RD6000 GS rear derailleur. Nominally it is 10 speed, however here it handles 11 to 50 11 speed cassette. And if we measure the slant angle of the derailleur, it comes out at approximately 45 degrees. The same as Z. However, this derailleur handles 1150 cassette. How is that possible? Well, if we measure the slant angle of the cassette, it comes out at about 70 degrees. So what gives? I'll explain in a minute. The answer is at the back of the derailleur. This Saint/Dior has the guide pulley coaxially with its pivot, as you can see, which means that the vertical position of the guide pulley is entirely dependent on the slant angle. As you shift to the lower gears, the guide pulley gets lower, 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 lower. However, if we take a look at the LX, you will quickly notice that the guide pulley is offset from the pivot if the cage is rotating around. What does it mean? Well, it means that the horizontal position of the guide pulley in this particular derailleur is not only dependent on the slant angle, but also on the position of the cage. And the position of the cage is obviously dependent on the size of the rings currently being used. You can actually depend only on the offset of the guide pulley to handle the curvature of the derailleur. And this is precisely what SRAM does in its 1x drivetrains. And if you think about this, It is also the reason why the 2-by drivetrains in SRAM use a slanted derailleur. The reason for this? Because the position of the guide pulley is dependent on the position of the angle. If you have two chain rings, you don't know which one is being engaged. So if you are adjusting your drivetrain to work well on one ring, it will not work on the other because the position of the cage is going to be different. So a derailleur for a multi-chain ring drivetrain should be slanted. However, when you're dealing with a 1-by system, you don't need to deal with multiple chain rings, so you always know the amount of chain being used on a given cog of the cassette, so you can entirely depend on the offset of the guide pulley to handle the curvature of your cassette. The parallelogram mechanism of a modern derailleur houses a spring called a return spring. You can see it here. This spring is responsible for returning, hence the name, the derailleur to a neutral position when you're changing gears, or actually releasing gears. On modern derailleurs, and this is true for majority derailleurs through history, the return spring would position the derailleur on the top gear when being fully released. This is called the top normal. A few years ago, Shimano attempted to popularize a reverse action of the rear derailleur return spring. In their marketing terms, it was called the rapid rise. However, the technical terms for this is low normal. In such derailleur, the return spring positions the derailleur in the neutral position on the lowest gear of the cassette. This has two distinct advantages. One, it automatically puts the return spring and the spring of the cage in opposite direction. So if you are tensioning the one because you are shifting top gears, you are actually releasing the spring of the cage. This provides for a very uniform and very light action of the lever. The second advantage is that the low normal rear derailleurs are much more resilient when it comes to ghost shifting. Let me show you how it works. Assume you are riding over rough terrain. The cage of the derailleur is obviously going to be jumping vividly, and what can happen is that if you pull here, you can see that the parallelogram starts to shift gears. There is quite a bit of force required to do it, but it's technically speaking possible. There is nothing stopping the parallelogram from going to a different gear. However, on a low normal derailleur, when this happens, there is usually a cable here that pretty much locks the parallelogram in place. So, simply put, low normal derailleurs are pretty much impossible to ghost shift. In spite of disadvantages, which are very important when you're riding on a mountain bike, low normal derailleurs are pretty much extinct. And the reason for this is very simple. How they operated was simply put against what people were used to. Which means that if you had 7 bikes and 2 of them would have a low normal rear derailleur, when you would switch bike from one direction of how the gears work to the other one, you would be met with incredible amount of frustration because the bike simply would work against your instinctual shifting, and that was infuriating. Each rear derailleur has several adjustments which are obviously needed to make the derailleur work reliably. This LX derailleur has 4. These are the limit screws, which are on each derailleur you will find on the market. One limits the swiveling of the parallelogram to the left, the other to the right, and they are needed to ensure that you're not going to shift into your frame, or more specifically into your spokes. The B tension is adjustment, which is here, which sets the tension of the spring in the B pivot, and a barrel adjuster for the cable. I will go through what each adjustment does in a different video. When dealing with a single pivot derailleur, the B tension adjustment here is replaced with a B position adjustment. The difference being that in the single pivot derailleur, this adjustment directly sets the position of the derailleur below the cassette. However, on a dual pivot design, you are just tensioning the spring, so the derailleur will sit a bit lower, but it will also behave a bit differently. Not every derailleur actually has a barrel adjuster, as you can see that Slant doesn't have one, because at some point Shimano decided to move the barrel adjuster from the derailleur to the shifter. The last important parameter of a rear derailleur is the length of the cage, which is the distance between the axes of the pulleys. This distance, or length of the cage, is directly proportional to the amount of chain a derailleur can handle or tension. Obviously, if you have, let's say, a triple chainring setup and a massive mountain cassette, there is a lot of chain to handle. On the other hand, if you have a downhill bike with a road cassette of the, 25 teeth maximum, and a single ring, there is a very little chain to handle. While you may instinctually want to buy the longest possible cage of your derailleur, because that gives you the biggest flexibility, there is a trade-off to be done here. The longer the cage of the derailleur, the less tension there is on the chain being handled. That's very simple. The springs on the pinnacle are usually the same regardless of the length of the cage of the derailleur of your choice. If there are, say, 3 possible versions of the derailleur, the one with the shortest cage will have the same spring here as the one with the longest cage. However, long cage is obviously a long lever. So, because all things are constant, the long cage has the least amount of force here that tensions your chain. This is important in mountain biking because when you're riding over rough stuff, the long cage derailleur will offer the least security of your chain, which is very annoying because it can end up with derailed chain or chain jumping over the cassette in a random manner. Modern rear derailleurs are almost universally equipped these days with a clutch. That is to a level where non-clutched versions are pretty much eliminated from the market. The reason for this is fairly simple, but it requires a little bit of exposition. In order to understand why clutched derailleurs are so popular among mountain bikers, popular to a level where they probably eliminated the non-clutched versions from the market, you first need to understand what happens when a bike hits an obstacle at speed. The initial impulse of the obstacle will cause the chain on the return path to oscillate wildly. This oscillation is going to be handled by the cage of the rear derailleur. However, since the spring in the pivot of the rear derailleur without the clutch isn't dumped in any way, this oscillation will go for a long while. Since you're riding on a mountain bike, you are hitting stuff all the time. So, if you hit something when the cage is in this position, your chain, being completely slack, might drop to the outside, drop to the inside. If you are really unlucky, the knobs on the rear tire are going to catch it and jam it between the chainstay and the tire, or the chain might start dancing on the cassette and you're going to find yourself in a gear you didn't want to be in the first place. Now, this problem is most severe with long cage derailleurs, and exactly to handle this problem, old tutorials or manuals or what have you about mountain biking would always advise you to ride downhill when you're most likely to hit stuff at speed on the big ring on the front and the biggest cock on the back. And this ancient advice worked because when your chain is on the big on the front and the big on the back, obviously this is a single, so big on the front is the only on the front. Imagine this is a triple. When the chain is on the big on the front and big on the back, the chain has least amount of freedom to jump around. However, when you're going downhill, you probably want to pedal a bit from time to time, and at speeds which you would probably downhill at, you want to have big on the front and something small on the back. Moreover, when mountain riding became more, let's just say, popular and more mature, mountain bikes started to lose chainrings, and the chainrings became became smaller. So in order to actually ride downhill and have a good gear in 2010, you'd have to solve the problem of big ring and small cogs on the back without losing your chain. And the solution would actually be a pulley here around the bottom bracket, which shortens the length of this chain, makes it pretty much impossible to drop the chain from the chainring when backpedaling or actually riding. And that would work. However, it's ugly, it's not really useful for everyone, and it introduces a bit of drag. Answer: the clutch. So how does a clutch derailleur work? There is a single directional friction clutch which you can buy off the shelf inside of the pivot of this derailleur. It works that it resists the movement of the cage in this direction. However, it doesn't restrict the return movement, which means that every time you want to pull the cage, you're going to dampen the movement just a little bit. It works very similarly, although on a quite different principle, to the rebound damping on your fork. Nothing, however, comes for free. The first thing you'll notice on a bike with a clutch derailleur is the fact that shifting to the lower gears became harder, because each time you shift, you have to overcome the friction in the derailleur. Moreover, if you have a full suspension bike, you have to deal with the fact that the clutch derailleur adds a little bit of compression damping to your suspension, because, well, if you are getting further into the travel, the chainstays are getting longer because of chainstay growth, so you need to overcome the friction of the derailleur. Moreover, because it's harder to shift, your housings and cables are going to get worn out a little bit faster. This, I think, covers the basics of the topic, and those really were the basics, because I am fairly sure that I could bellyache for several hours about cages, pulleys, parallelograms, pull ratios, atypical designs, maybe even areas which we could improve this device. And I am fairly sure that some of you are going to say that this needs to die and we need to get gearboxes in our bikes. That's not really that simple, but that is a topic for another video. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.